How are we doing with the mic? Is it on in the back?
Yep.
How about now?
Yeah.
Do you feel like we need the mic? Maybe. We'll try it out. Thank you all so much for joining us. Tonight we have a special event. As you all know, the British National Debate Team has been touring with the CIDD, and we're very excited to have a presentation this evening. Unfortunately, Willard wasn't able to join us, so Eddie's going to be here all on her own, but we're excited to have an LD-style format over an important controversial question of Scottish secession. On the affirmative this evening, we have Calum Matheson, who's a Ph.D. student in communication at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the assistant debate coach at Harvard University, a two-time semifinalist at the National Debate Tournament, and a finalist at CETA. And he was the top speaker at Georgia State, Kentucky, twice the Kentucky Round Robin, Harvard, twice the University of Southern California, Fullerton, Northwestern, and CETA. On the affirmative, Calum Matheson, round of applause. On the negative this evening, we have Ettie Bailey-King. She's a recent graduate with a degree in English Literature from Durham University. She's a Fulbright Special Programs Scholar at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She debated for Durham University at the Worlds Tournament, both in the European and the World's Championships. She's coached debate not only in Durham, but throughout the world. And in her off time, when she's not being an important scholar and debater, she does volunteer aid work abroad throughout the world. So a round of applause, please, for Ettie. This evening, we will adopt a Lincoln Douglas style format. We will have a first affirmative constructive for 6 minutes. We will then add in a 3-minute cross-examination, then a first negative constructive for 8 minutes, have a 3-minute cross-examination. Then we'll have a 4-minute 1AR, a 6-minute 2NR, and then a 4-minute 2AR. So to begin this evening, let's please welcome Calum to the stand for a 6-minute cross-examination on resolved Scotland should be an independent state.
Thanks, Jared. In 1707, Scotland feared for its future. Influenced by economic hardship and direct bribes, its parliament ratified the Act of Union. The unequal partnership which resulted is met with fierce popular resistance. Today, this union has run its course. Scotland's future should be independent. Rivers of Scottish blood were poured in the battlefields of North America, South Asia, and Europe in defense of a rapacious empire, and it is time for change. I propose that Scotland should be free not out of hatred, not to look back to an ideal past which never existed. I propose that Scotland look forward. I urge you to see the justice of a position which is not no to England, but yes to Scotland. Europe today is racked by a debate between austerity and social justice. Writing for the Financial Times, Peter Spiegel described this as the crisis in Europe that threatens to throw the project of integration into reverse. While the UK was once a model for social welfare policies, these are now being rent asunder by a neoliberal economy. Scotland has chosen the side of social justice. Free university tuition, a living wage, and job security. These are positions that are held dearly in Scotland, but Scots make up only 5 million of the UK's 62 million souls. And as long as the union persists, the Scottish hope for a humane society will not triumph. As First Minister Alex Salmond argued in his Hugo Young lecture, an independent Scotland could be a beacon for progressive opinion south of the border and further afield, addressing policy challenges in ways which reflect the universal values of fairness. He continues that we cannot innovate as much as we would like. Policy choices made in Westminster by parties whose democratic mandate in Scotland is negligible are constraining the policy choices made in Scotland, for which there is an unequivocal mandate. Scotland's ability to assert equality against the dehumanizing economic logic of neoliberalism is also an issue of popular sovereignty. Whether austerity is necessary or not, Scots should be free to decide for themselves. The Declaration of Our Growth declared Scottish independence almost 700 years ago. It served as a model for the American Declaration of Independence. It was also the first document in Europe to declare the right of a people to overthrow a ruler who threatened their liberty. We need not cling to the past, but we should recognize that the spirit of liberty might still have the power to inspire others and give solace to those who believe that human rights should not be suppressed in the name of economics. Scotland can serve as an international model in other ways. The Scottish National Party has taken a strong stand against nuclear weapons, and the entire British nuclear arsenal is based in Scotland, as there are no ports elsewhere in the country able to sustain a nuclear infrastructure. As Matthew Fargo of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation argues, were Scotland to achieve independence, the UK would be forced to disarm. We should welcome this result, as Fargo argues, because British disarmament would divorce the power and prestige of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council from the possession of nuclear weapons. The UK would be the first NPT state to fulfill its Article 6 obligation to good faith nuclear disarmament. There's no longer a rationale for British nuclear weapons, if there ever was. Retaining the arsenal merely increases the risk of tragic accidents and undermines British diplomatic credibility. As Sir Hugh Beach Milne, former Master General of the Ordnance of the British Armed Forces, has said, the end of Britain's nuclear program would be a convincing argument against the need to acquire nuclear status, and a message to other states that the potential for genocidal violence ought not determine a country's importance. The opposition to Scottish independence has relied transparently on scaremongering. They've claimed that Scotland would not be admitted into the European Union, a position contradicted in legal documents such as Your Scotland, Your Voice. What would Europe have to gain by keeping Scotland out? Some in the British government say that Spain would block Scottish EU accession, which the Spanish foreign minister himself said was absolutely false. Some have claimed that Scottish independence would set a dangerous model for secessionist movements abroad, leaving aside the moral implications of this argument that we should accept colonialism for the purpose of stability. We should ask instead how a peaceful constitutional separation might set a precedent against violence. To illustrate how ludicrous and desperate the anti-independence movement has become, I have one last example. The Daily Mirror suggested that the pandas in the Edinburgh Zoo would be seized by the British government as a matter of national security. Fortunately and humanely, First Minister Alex Salmond has already agreed to grant the panda bears political asylum. The most common scare story, however, is economic. In fact, Scotland is oil rich, but its export revenues currently go to the national government. Whiskey exports alone provided £4 billion this year, and the shipbuilding industry on the River Clyde could see a renaissance under a government that bothered to support it. Energy and business analyst Dick Winchester argues that a free Scotland could establish its own stock exchange and central bank, which would provide the gravitas and support needed to develop a more vibrant Scottish economic and financial sector, able to support Scottish companies at all stages of development. Not bad for a country of 5 million people without the UK's extravagant defense outlays and other commitments. In fact, austerity is projected to increase the United Kingdom's national debt, a burden that Scotland currently will pay, but under an independent regime of social justice is likely to pay back instead. As social justice and free education increases the export revenues of the country and the human capital that it relies on, Scotland is likely to face a brighter economic future independently rather than as part of the United Kingdom. So Scotland is faced with a choice. It can heed the voices of fear and despair. It can decide that economic worries outweigh social justice. It can decide not to rock the sinking ship of British military power, not to risk upsetting some mythical European bureaucrats. It can embrace negativity and live as a cowed and humble vassal to a state that has treated it often with indifference and sometimes with outright cruelty. Or Scotland can make another choice. It can embrace hope. It can declare its independence. It can be free to care for itself and others, free to join Europe as an equal, free to shear the chains of doubt and pessimism, free to build an inclusive society. So while others say no, I ask you to join me and say yes.
I have a 3-minute propaganda.
Do I just ask from here? Can everybody hear me at the back? Is that okay? Yeah, you can kind of hear? Okay, firstly, you said that a free Scotland could establish its own stock exchange. Firstly, Scotland has absolutely no past history of financial expertise, and all of its banks benefited from a £65 billion bailout from the UK government. Firstly, is that fair? And secondly, is it true to say that Scotland would have any ability to have credibility on the world stage, or would it in fact look like a tin pot attempt at a stock exchange into which nobody would buy?
Well, there are a number of good responses to that. Scottish companies have been successful, although Scotland has not had a stock exchange in recent memory. Other countries that have seceded from their colonial masters have managed to make it okay on their own. The argument that I'm quoting here, and a financial investigation that went into it, is based on a series of economic studies who think that a Scottish stock exchange would flourish rather than be a tin pot attempt at national independence, partly under the power of Scotland's oil and gas exports and its successful history of shipbuilding, heavy industry, whiskey exports, and so on. So although it is true that the fears of financial stability are a legitimate response to Scotland's independence, they're most certainly not a fair one.
In what currency would that stock exchange operate?
There's been some debate about that. There's a possibility that Scotland could join the Eurozone if it wished to, but more likely it would continue to operate under the English pound. The British pound is an internationally traded currency, which, despite the threats of some in the Treasury, means that the United Kingdom could not prevent Scotland from keeping the currency if it wished. Scotland would be in an advantageous position because it would have a chance to choose currencies based on its export potential and on the world market at the time. The euro might be beneficial because it would avoid Dutch disease and Scottish oil exports. The pound might be beneficial because it has the investor certainty that comes with backing by the Bank of England.
Right, it's not true that Scotland could choose to have the pound. They would only be allowed to stay in sterling if the UK government granted that to them.
Absolutely false. Just like the country of Belize, which uses the US dollar, without the US Treasury's approval, Scotland, because the pound is an internationally traded currency, could purchase the pound and use it.
but the Bank of Scotland exists under a constitutional act from the UK government.
That's about to change, isn't it?
The UK wouldn't.
Well, once Scotland is an independent state, there's a lot about the UK constitution that would no longer be relevant in the free state north of the border.
Okay, if Scotland joined the euro, how attractive do you think that would be as an investment spot, given that the euro currently ranks as the second least popular currency when bond traders and future investors are looking at where to put their money?
That's the beauty of Scotland having a choice between the euro, the pound, or its own independent currency. But if you're asking me whether I think it would be attractive, I will be the first to invest, I promise.
You suggested that Scotland can only keep up its programme of fairness and socialism if it's independent from the UK. But right now, receiving its grant of money from the Westminster government, it's able to have free university care, free elderly care, free pension, very generous pension provision, free prescriptions, and free nursery care. All of these are extremely socialist policies, extremely fair, but they're only made possible by the money from Westminster. Do you not think that, firstly, tax receipts would be lower if Scotland were independent, but secondly, that they can continue all of that good stuff and stay in the Union?
You've asked me a whole rack of questions and include a number of assertions as well. I'll try to break it down as best as I can, but although those things do exist in an independent Scotland, and you are right, they are quite fair. It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? They're also under threat by the UK's austerity programs, and may change in the future. In the long term, Scotland is unlikely to keep its socially more liberal, its socially just policies in the face of overwhelming English opposition. So the second part of your question is premised on a previous question, which I've already answered, which is about whether Scotland would be economically successful independently of the United Kingdom. The Trident modernization program alone will cost something like £100 billion. That's an awful lot of happy Scottish university students.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for coming here tonight. It's very sad that I'm not here with my partner, Willard, because he wears a kilt, the sporran of which is made from a real badger's head, and I feel that alone would have won us the debate. The other thing is that he wears the kilt of the Unionists, because he's one of the Scots that frickin' loves England, and he loves Westminster, and that also, I think, would have been a strong point. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight is firstly, about how secession would not be good for Scottish welfare in the short term. Secondly, in the long term, why it would be a disaster. And thirdly, about cultural identity and how I think the proposition case takes a very crude and very broad brush approach to the idea that countries can be different, but they can all operate together in happy unison. Feels quite ironic that I'm standing here in the south of the USA trying to argue that small states shouldn't secede. I hope you'll bear with me. Sorry. Okay, but briefly some rebuttal, because we have massive assertions from the proposition side. Because firstly he said all this stuff about how Scotland could establish its own stock exchange. And just everything that we know about Scottish financial expertise, all of its infrastructure, its ability to access other currencies, does not bear that out, ladies and gentlemen. That's simply impossible. And yet that was one of his visions of what a free and independent Scotland would look like. Not only is that rubbish, I'm going to show you how all of the other things that he outlined and were dependent upon independence don't exist. He also said that fairness and socialism can't exist with the Westminster government. But not only have I given you all the examples of how it happens right now, but he told you austerity threatens that. And that is simply not the case, because in the first round, the second round, and the third round of our austerity cuts, the things that were not touched were things like Scottish university fees. They went up in England, ladies and gentlemen, and they went up to the tune of £9,000, which may not sound like a lot to you, but is 3 times the going rate. So if there's any problem in fairness and distribution of resources, it lies firmly on his side of the house, in terms of the fact that Scotland has manifestly benefited from masses of generosity from the Westminster government. Now, I'm going to make, towards the end of my case, a moral argument, which is that given Scotland has been a gross recipient of Westminster money, it's not morally fair for it to leave the Union right now when it has benefited in excess of hundreds of billions of pounds. But I'll come on to that later. So firstly, why is it not best, not in the best interest of Scotland in the short term? Well, firstly, economically, because Scotland's finances are crazily imbalanced. And you probably don't know much about this, but this is quite a common topic around slightly pretentious dinner tables all over the UK. Because we all know that the average Scottish taxpayer receives £10,000 in benefits, in spending, from Westminster. And we know that the average English taxpayer only receives £8,500 of that money, even though they pay disproportionately more taxes. More money is currently going to Scotland so that they can live in their socialist paradise, whereas we in the UK are struggling under the burden of neoliberal austerity. It's really, really bad, but it's not as neoliberal as you guys. Now, why is that a problem? Well, firstly, the finances are so misbalanced that they actually needed to be sorted out within the union for reasons of fairness and equity, and because they're deeply unsustainable. And if Scotland exited the union right now, they would be left with an enormous budget shortfall. I'll get the figures, one moment. That shortfall would be, we project, £14 billion for the previous year. We don't have the figures for 2010/11, but then given that it's gone up by 2 billion years on the previous year, I'm going to say £16 billion in deficit because they want to have their socialist policies without having very high tax rates at all. That's not fair. They need to sort that out within the union, and they need to even out that structural incoherence. Now, their finances are also misbalanced because he's projected that Scottish oil is going to stay valuable, which is a massive assertion because the Scottish oil fields have they've gone way beyond peak capacity. That happened in the 1990s. They're now operating on the downward slope of production and how much they're worth. They're really mature oil fields, so they're really expensive to drill, and they're only worth drilling if oil is very expensive. If oil prices crash, not only will it not be worth drilling any of that oil, but it will also be too expensive because it's such difficult drilling processes, and you get even less of that money for even lower prices. Now that was a central plank of why he thought that Scotland was a viable independent nation. And when we look at the other things that he mentioned, which frankly was just whiskey, that's not enough to support a complex growing economy on. At the moment, it gets a lot of money from Westminster, it gets a lot of development grants from the EU, and that all rests on it being in the UK. I'm going to go on to talk later about how there's no reason to think that Scotland would be allowed to stay in the EU if it was independent. So not only is that just financially crazy, but it means that we're pinning our hopes on a short-term, very centered in the now kind of attitude, because we think that this year there's money in oil. In 5 or 10 years, there may be extremely little money in oil, and that's crazy short-term thinking, and it's just not worth it. So moving on to why the EU would likely not allow Scotland to be a member, and why that would mean that it's cut out of the funding network, wouldn't be able to access development aid, and would have to give up a lot of its very cushy privileges that it really likes. Well, firstly, there is no legal right for a country that secedes from its mother nation to stay in the EU. We know that because the Constitution is silent on this matter, and all of the legal experts agree that in the absence of any information, just being someone I know, in the absence of any given legal provision for that, it would have to go to a vote of all of the EU members. That's 28 nations, ladies and gentlemen. Now, why would they not vote in agreement? Firstly, because they don't want another ailing economy coming on board with no history of financial independence, no history of knowing how to govern itself, because at the moment it only governs social policy from Holyrood, and that is totally different to directed fiscal policy, ladies and gentlemen. And I know how far I would trust the Scots to manage that issue, given their level of expertise, which is minimal. So that's going to go to a 28-member vote. Why is that a problem? People like Spain, people like Belgium, people like the Netherlands are extremely worried about this increasing trend towards regionalism and secession. They're really scared by it. So Madrid is scared of Catalonian secession because a lot of their money comes from Barcelona and from that thriving economy. They do not want to lose Catalonia. So if this could be seen as a precedent for them to leave the EU, they will do their darndest to stop that happening. The same would be true of the Flanders region in Belgium, the same is true of those Dutch regions. So we know that the political will is not there to allow Scotland on board. Now, secondly, why is that a problem? Because right now, Scotland is a disproportionate recipient of EU development funds. Why is that? Because it's within a trusted economy that has contributed hugely to EU funds. The UK, the Westminster government, has piled billions of pounds into the EU, and they're very thankful for that. But that two-way recognition of gratitude is not likely to continue. And I'm going to tell you that his Scotland is going to be shut out of the cold because his Scotland does not deserve any of that in exchange from the EU. Now, secondly, what's the problem with a future Scotland that stands on its own? Well, I think that its financial industry is just totally illegit. I've told you that. Halifax Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland received £65 billion in bailouts from Westminster. Does that sound like a healthy and attractive financial industry to you? No, me neither. The expertise is not there. And they couldn't replicate that kind of bailout in the future. And when you're looking to invest in a sturdy economy, you look for a country that has the resources or the ability to raise money through deficit finance or the ability to raise taxes on a wealthy and productive economy. And because Scotland has none of these things, it has a tiny, tiny population of 5 million people. Pretty sure that's less than the entire population of North Carolina. Actually, it definitely is. And this tells us that, you know, even if they try to market themselves as like the new Hong Kong, it's just not going to be believable in the perceptual field of things internationally. Now, because of that minuscule ability to raise funds, it also means that, and I should mention that, I'm running out of time. Okay, quickly. So, Scotland will be locked in by realities of 2014, which are no longer relevant. Thirdly, cultural identity. So Scottish sovereignty isn't going to just like crystallise this problem of regional identity. Identity is really complex. It's a shifting set of anxieties. It's very varied. I will finish, don't worry. I think concentric circles of identity are a much more useful way of looking at things. I'm English first, I'm British second. That works for me. I think that paying lip service to regional difference doesn't do much. It devolves things, but it doesn't solve the problem. And I think it gives way for a dangerous paradigm of identity politics, where only my club can represent me, and it begins to raise the question of who can ever represent anybody. I think it's much more mature, much more sensible to stay in the union, and I beg to oppose.
Not when we take our sovereignty, but 2 minutes of our time to boot. All right, so you said that the Spanish wouldn't allow Scotland to join the European Union. I read you a quote from the Spanish foreign minister who said that that is absolutely false. Although I will agree with you that it's a commonly cited statement in English newspapers. Where exactly do you draw your conclusions that the Spanish veto Scottish secession? Can you read me anything that the Spanish foreign minister said, the Prime Minister, anyone in the European Union?
I'm going to give you two answers to that, and the second one includes lots of quotes. The first one, the reason the Spanish dude is going to say that is that he can't be seen by his country to be blocking European progress. It looks cynical, it looks extremely shifty.
You sure about that? Because you're going to read a bunch of quotes to the contrary, so it sounds like that has not stopped the rest of your information.
Let me finish. That's why a Spanish leader would not be willing to do that. Because it looks very naughty and it looks like what we suspect all of our leaders to be doing. It looks like they're guarding their self-interest. But in practice, as I told you, I think that is what they're going to do. Okay, secondly, who are the quotes? Well, the current president of the European Council and the current president of the European Commission both said explicitly that Scotland would have no legal right to enter the EU purely by being the product of a mother country. They then went on to say that Alex Salmond had lied on radio when he implied that there was legal reason to think that Scotland could join the EU. I'm not going to read you the quotes because I don't have them verbatim, but you can Google them, my friend.
I'm sure that they do exist, however. I'm sure that Prime Minister Salmond lied. Prime Minister? First Minister, I'm looking ahead. You've also said that the Scottish economy will collapse. You've decided that Scotland will inherit a good part of the debt. Do you have any evidence that suggests that?
What, that the Scottish economy will collapse?
Yes.
I can tell you
You began with saying, by the way, that oil prices will collapse. So let's start there. You've said that, I am half American, so I will admit that I'm a wee bit biased on this. But do you have any evidence that we're about to just kick the oil dependence habit?
Okay, so by 2040, all Scottish oil fields will be 100% exhausted. We know this. By 2020, they will be so low in number.
We know this? I'm sorry. By evidence, I meant, can you provide external verification for the argument that you have made?
Dude, I'm not a policy debater. I'm not going to have facts of paper and stuff. You can research that, trust me. But the point stands that based on all of our other knowledge of oil fields and their resources, they are not there aren't big enough yields to make it worthwhile harvesting. If we look at other events in the energy world, we can see that in England, near Blackpool, one of the biggest ever deposits of shale gas has been discovered. That's bigger than the operating capacity of Venezuela every year. That's the kind of shift which is going to distort oil prices.
Shale gas will destroy oil prices.
Sorry, energy prices. What that does is that a major economy like the UK, which would typically be using that energy because it's close to it, is going to look elsewhere, and it doesn't need to buy that Scottish oil, or rather to use it.
One of the joys of policy debate is the concept of uniqueness. Evidence to the effect that Scotland's economy, or even assertions, I should say, to the effect that Scotland's economy is doing poorly now, must answer the question of why that is so. Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. The promise of prosperity in Scottish growth is belied by all of the evidence that Scotland's economy is performing poorly. Remember that oil revenues in Scotland currently go to the central funds in Westminster. Salmon's argument and our argument is not that Scotland can't possibly generate revenue, it is that Scotland cannot innovate adequately, which is also why Scottish social programs are unlikely to survive the tidal wave of austerity that comes from our far more conservative south. Arguments about Scottish identity I will dismiss out of hand. We do appreciate your benevolent attempts to define yourselves as our mother country, but the United Kingdom did not give rise to Scotland. It is the result of the 1707 Treaty of Union, meaning that a dissolution of the state is not Scottish secession, it is overturning the Act of Union, which helps to define the British Constitution. The European Union would have no incentive to keep Scotland out once the deed was done, although they might talk big now, because they fear secession, but Scotland as an independent state by itself is unlikely to cause a wave of secession. Why would the Scottish economy collapse? Why would the European Union block Scottish accession? My opponent would have you believe that evidence for this is unnecessary. She says that she is not a policy debater and therefore cannot provide the evidence. That is the one argument that my opponent has made that I will surely agree with for the rest of this debate. The evidence does exist to the contrary, however, not in just the spoken statements of the Spanish foreign minister, but in legal advice sought by the SNP, the Yes Scotland, or Your Scotland, Your Voice report, which I mentioned in the 1AC, came out in 2012 and says that Scotland would be likely to rejoin the European Union. Even if it couldn't, this argument amounts to a politics of fear, that Scotland should stay as part of its colonial vassalage because it fears the economic consequences of independence. That we fear the economic consequences of a Scottish voice, of Scottish control over Scottish oil. This argument boils down to the claim that we would be unable to govern ourselves. We did just fine, thank you, between 1320 and 1707 when we decided to create the United Kingdom in the first place. Scotland has a history of independence, and it may not have a stock exchange or history of that. That's not even necessary for Scottish survival. There's plenty of international expertise that Scotland could draw on. I'd also like to mention that my opponent is silent about the question of nuclear weapons. For those of you who have ever read the book Fate of the Earth, I'll summarize this briefly. I've won. But if they do bother to respond, the important part of that is not just that British nuclear disarmament would send a signal to the rest of the world that makes it more secure, that decouples the voice of international power from the threat of genocidal violence, but that the Trident modernization program alone will cost £100 billion over the next 10 years. Whiskey exports, which are only £4 billion, are, by the way, a full quarter of the deficit you've said that Scotland will inherit. Whiskey exports at £4 billion are less than 10% of Scottish export revenue, most of which comes from oil and gas. The United States, its allies, and the Western world are unlikely to give up oil anytime soon. Energy prices are not the same as oil prices. I'm going to keep this brief because I think I understand my audience, but natural gas is unlikely to displace oil and cars anytime soon. Scottish oil is likely to last a while, and oil demand is unlikely to decrease in the near term. In fact, the Herald quoted the Herald in 2012, quoting an industry report by the North Sea gas and oil industry, said that oil prices will remain buoyant for at least another 10 years, and that Scotland has more than enough to attract firms and international investment. In fact, it described it as posting bumper profits for 2011. So despite the politics of fear, despite the threats against our identity and our economy, the future looks bright for Scotland, and at least, I must say, there is a vision. If we are to fall, we will fall alone, and we may stand alone, but we will never kneel.
I've only just noticed that Calum has been saying we about Scotland, which, don't know about you, doesn't sound very Scottish to me, but could be wrong with my foreign ears. Okay, firstly I'm going to ask, is Scotland viable on an economic and practical level? Secondly, I'm going to talk about, is it a cultural entity? Do we buy any of his chat about being a vassal that will not be pushed to her knees? I'm going to tell you, Scotland is pretty happy being in the Union, but before I do that, some rebuttal. Actually, before I do that, a little bit more rebuttal, which is that he talked as though national opinion was heavily in favour of Scotland leaving the Union. The most recent poll that I read had that at a high, an all-time high of 30%. Does that sound like you to the democratic will of a nation that's desperate to get out from an oppressive English parliament? I don't think so. I think the reason that only 30% of people would even entertain leaving the UK, and that's because they believe they could also enter the EU, is because they don't think it's viable. So why is that the case? Because he tried to imply that all of the hard facts are on his side of the debate, and all the empty rhetoric is on mine. Well, he didn't respond to any of my economic data about why a £65 billion bailout of Halifax and Royal Bank of Scotland, for instance, was not sustainable and why they couldn't continue to raise funds. So why is it not viable economically? Right. Socialist policies that cost an enormous amount of money, which exceed the present value of Scottish tax receipts, are what we have right now. They are made possible by the generous munificence from Westminster, from the UK government. He would argue that Scotland on its own is able to continue its policies of fairness and equality. This is clearly not the case. This reminds me a little bit of Romney in the presidential debates saying, I'm not going to cut taxes, but I'm going to increase military spending massively. Do the maths, go figure. There is a massive shortfall right now in Scottish budget. That's the first reason why it's not economically viable. Secondly, a lot of Scottish industries right now draw their strength from being part of the UK. They pool their financial exposure, they pool their risk. They do things like, currently, a lot of Scottish businesses share their legal protection, things like malfeasance insurance with English companies. You take them out of that, they face higher costs and dwindling people who want to go and use their companies. Why is that? Because typically most Scottish companies draw their business south of the border from England, from the rest of the UK, where the population is. There's a reason I told you that the population of Scotland is teeny tiny, like the size of North Carolina. Why does that matter? Because a country that is this small can talk all that it likes about standing on its own 2 feet and having meaningful power and autonomy and self-assertion. But if it doesn't have the population to raise taxes realistically, if it doesn't have the income from those said people generating tax, because as we know, Scottish people have the lowest wages in the entirety of the UK, then again, how are they going to do this? I don't think it's really going to happen. And lastly, is it practical to do this? Because I've explained to you that there is an infrastructure right now for there to be a Scottish Parliament which exists, it's devolved from the Westminster Parliament. But even to set up all the infrastructure that he talked about would be expensive, and I don't see how that's going to help what I would define as an ailing economy. He talked about nuclear disarmament, said that was really awesome, and it set a really great precedent for the world. Firstly, I don't agree that nuclear disarmament would be a wonderful thing. Secondly, I see no reason that Faslane in the Clyde would have any reason not to exist. The UK military currently organises and runs that. If they felt like it, because an independent Scotland would have to negotiate with the UK as to what kind of protection they could share, England would be entirely justified to say, no, you're going to keep the nukes, sorry, because right now Scotland couldn't afford to buy its own frigates or its own naval patrol equipment, so on. So again, the point here is that the English power rests in Westminster, and that even an independent Scotland would constantly have to be negotiating with that English Parliament to decide what they're going to do on their own. Is Scotland going to have its own defence staff? Is it going to have an international military? Is it going to contribute to wars? I don't think so. We haven't had any hard evidence to suggest that Scotland could muster that independent infrastructure, that it could protect its own borders, that it could even raise its own taxes and govern its fiscal affairs in a responsible fashion. All he's told us is they love socialism and they don't have the money to support it. I think that sounds like a country that isn't going to work on its own, and for these reasons, I vote to oppose.
The country would be too small, they're resource rich, but they'd be poor. They don't know how to govern themselves. Really, they just want to be like us. The British said these things about America before 1776. They said them about Ireland. They said them about India, about Kenya, Sudan, Egypt, Palestine, Zimbabwe. My opponent is saying it about Scotland now. If you followed her logic, there would be white faces, red coats, and bad food scattered throughout Asia and Africa to this very day. The only reason that the sun never set on the British Empire is because even God didn't trust it in the dark. Scotland may not be able to contribute to the international wars of the United States and the UK, but the world would be bloody off better for it. To answer the question, by the way, since I've obviously used an English slang word of why I do not sound Scottish, is because I've been carrying the wrong passport for the last 30 years. All I ask of you is to help me rewrite the face of it so the proper country is represented. There's fear about whether Scotland could afford to survive on its own, but this politics of fear is precisely what defeated the empire in the first place. It is why we were in Iraq. It is why Britain feels like it needs to spend hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining its defense. The Daily Mail and the Huffington Post published the same article saying that Scotland would be able to pay for its own defense and save 1.5 billion pounds every year. Would we have a massive army? No. Would we get rid of nuclear weapons? Yes. The S&P has already announced it. The British government has no other plans to rebase. My opponent seems to imply that the English would force us to keep nuclear weapons in Scotland. By exactly what? Are you going to drop the Queen out of a helicopter? If you've ever been to the east part of Glasgow, you know who's likely to win that confrontation. And it's not Queen Elizabeth I, since there was never a Queen Elizabeth I of Scotland prior to this. Why do I say we? I say we for this reason. I say we because Scotland hopes for unity. It hopes for a world of social justice, of fairness, a society that we define for ourselves. You can say a lot of things about whether it is legitimate to make an argument based on nationalism, although that has not yet been presented in the debate. What you cannot do is define my nationality for me, nor the nationality of the Scots who have said that they are likely to secede. The most recent poll my opponent read, I will assume, is at least 300 years old, since she's provided no evidence of it. There is, however, on a European website called ACE, a news site popular throughout Europe, a poll that suggests that the Scottish referendum, the last vote, the Scottish referendum is likely to succeed with overwhelming support because the SNP has been returned as the dominant party in Scotland whose main social agenda is secession. If not everyone in Scotland yet sees the bright future that we hope to offer them, it is a testament to what has happened with us, what has happened to our soul and spirit and its incorporation into a colonial power that has slowly ground us into dust even while we eat the consequences of their foreign wars. There are 1 million Scottish dead in the War Graves Commission's graveyards abroad. We've done enough for the empire. Let us goddamn go. It's finally time. The claim that it is unjust because we owe the English for the bailout is similar to saying that India should pay Britain back from the roads that it used to colonize the country. The military roads are the roads, the Wade roads they're called, after the 15, are the primary roads in the Highlands. We thank you for the infrastructure, but we believe that our blood, our lives, our culture, and our freedom are probably payment enough at this juncture. If we make another loan, you can charge us interest. It seems to be unlikely, however, because Scottish industry would thrive. But if it doesn't, this is just fear. This is the fear of the future. This is the fear that has defeated every attempt for secession in the past. It's just benevolent colonialism. There is no evidence. I read you quotes, policy experts, so on and so forth. This fear should not cripple us. We should no longer live as a vassal state in a colonial empire that looks only past to its dying glory. The sun is set. It's time for a brighter Scottish future.
Please, let's give one more round of applause for all of the debaters. Thank you all very much for joining us. If any of you would like to come forward and talk to the debaters, I'm sure they'd enjoy hearing some of your feedback. And in about 20 minutes or so, we'll start the Coach of the Year award right here. Thank you.